Okay, welcome to another segment of the Real Mike Pittman Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Pittman, and joining me on the show today is a very interesting guest I had the pleasure of finding out about on CNN. Her name is Tracie McMillan. Tracie is the author of a book that she just wrote. I believe it's out now. I think it just
Yep.
came out.
Yes, indeed.
And it's called The White Bonus, where she interviewed five families throughout white families in America, and where it talked about how wealth was generated for them and how it affected the black community. And she has a very interesting story. She's also an award-winning uh, journalist as well. I'll just kind of read you her brief bio here, if you will. Uh, Tracie is a rural Midwestern transplant to New York City. Like I stated, she's the author of the book, The White Bonus, Five Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America, and a New York Times bestseller, The American Way of Eating, which won the Books for a Better Life Award and the Hillman Prize for Book Journalism. A one-time target of Rush Limbaugh. McMillan also oversees national coverage of organizing for Capital in Maine. Tracie has received fellowships from the Russell Sage Foundation, McDowell, and the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellows at the University of Michigan. Her essays in journalism have been published in the New York Times, Mother Jones Harper, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, National Geographic, and elsewhere. She is a two-time finalist for a Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism, a Livingston Award finalist, and the winner of the Harry Chapin Media Award, the James Aronson Prize for Social Justice Journalism, and the James Beard Foundation Journalism Award. She has spoken widely about her topics and topics it covers for audiences ranging from the Logan Symposium on Investigating Reporter to the Chautauqua Institution, Seattle Town Hall to Texas A&M University. Previously, Tracie served as a fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism, the managing editor of City Limits Magazine in New York, and a member of the James Beard Foundation Media Awards Journalism Committee, where she pushed for broader racial, economic, and geographic diversity in judging panels. Her career began with an internship under the legendary investigative reporter at the Village Voice, Wayne Barrett. In 2023, she began editing coverage of working organizing at the award-winning news site Capital in Maine. Tracie was a scholarship kid at New York University, where she received her BA in political science. Born and raised in the exurbs between Flint and Detroit, she currently spends her time between Brooklyn, New York, and Detroit, Michigan. That is a very impressive bio.
Thank you.
You've done a lot.
I worked hard. I worked hard on that.
Yeah, you sure have. Well, we'll go ahead and kind of get started, Tracie. I kind of read your bio, and people kind of have an idea who you are, and just want to start talking about the book. Yeah, what compelled you to want to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I got to a point where I felt like, as a white person, in particular as a white woman in America, I really wanted to understand what I got for being white. I think there's this question that most white people, certainly most white folks who don't come up with, serious wealth, my family is middle class, somewhere in the middle class, right? Everybody in my family is somewhere in the middle class. But we're not Elon Musk. Nobody's retired, nobody's just living off of a trust or anything like that. And I think so often when we talk about racial privilege and white privilege, it's really talking about white wealth and white advantage, right? So it sort of has both of those things. And so a lot of people outside of that upper economic bracket are sort of like, well, what do I actually get for white privilege? Where's my check, right? And so for me as a journalist, I thought, well, I'm actually interested to know, like, what do I get, right? What do I get for being white, and can I measure it? And so I came up with this idea of the white bonus. And so instead of looking at racism only as something that sort of denies and fails to extend benefits to people of color, especially to Black people, that we needed to start looking at it as something that actually grants and gives benefits to white folks. I mean, I should say, the work I'm doing doesn't make sense absent a strong and robust conversation about the harms that racism does, right? Obviously, people of color are hurt the most by racism. But I feel like if we want to end racism, we kind of have to get at this question of what is it giving to people? So how can we defuse that?
Okay. Well, you write about how reporting and writing your first book, The American Way of Eating, prompted you to confront your race in a new way. Can you talk about that experience and how it led you again to write The Right Bonus, which I believe you just kind of answered, a little bit of that question. It's, my mind just goes to something else, a question I have for you in relation to this book, and maybe I'll ask it as you get more into this. There'll probably be an appropriate time to ask it. But you've written about white resentment and the right poor families for places like the New York Times. What did you learn about white grievance in reporting the White Bonus, and what can it tell us about the political landscape of 2024?
Yeah, so the thing that I learned about white grievance and resentment with the White Bonus, and I'm working on being able to say this in a concise way, so I hope you'll bear with me. But, the reason we need to talk about how racism helps white people is really important here, because white people mostly, I believe, and my reporting backs this up, we mostly think that, like, well, government never did anything special for me, and I've just worked really hard, and so I deserve what I've gotten because I put in the time and the effort, and I did all this stuff. And what that is that's hiding this very clear set of benefits that government has been giving to white people, and gave them particularly in the mid 20th century, right? So when you have the GIs coming back from World War II, right? The GI Bill, FHA loans, like all that stuff that lets you get college education for free and build mobility. That's stuff that, government that, folks in DC knew they were building these programs, and they said it was for everybody, but they knew it would be targeted by race, right? They knew that most of those benefits were going to go to white people. That was why they supported it, right? And so white people act like the stuff we got because of the GI Bill and the FHA loan, that's just natural, right? And that nothing was going on. And so you have that, right? So white people got all this stuff, but we act like they weren't given anything, that it was just natural. And then what happened is, as you deindustrialize, right, you take away that sort of automatic movement into the middle class that was developed, right? And so all of a sudden, white people who think they never got anything have the thing they weren't even told they had. It gets taken away, right? Because now, if you want to get into the middle class, you got to go all the way through college, right? You got to go into debt to do that. When I was coming out of high school, you didn't have to do that, right? Like, you could just go work in a factory and you had a social contract, right? So now what is happening, right, is we have this situation where white people don't understand they were given anything. Their circumstances change because of the changes we made in the economy. And they don't sort of understand, I think often don't understand what's happening, right? And so they're looking for, like, why is this bad, right? And then there are a lot of people who really benefit, right, from creating division, right? Politically, you can build a lot of power by creating division and saying, well, you know why this sucks? You know why it's hard now that you can't get into the middle class? That's because of people who don't look like you, not because we changed the economy, right? But because people don't look like you're taking your job or making it difficult, right? It's really easy to leverage power by using racism in that way. And I'm not saying there's no racism to begin with, but I think it becomes much less potent when there's not that kind of economic fear.
Interesting. As when you start talking about wealth and the transfer of wealth, and as far as in America, interesting fact that I, had some numbers on the eve of the Civil War, Black people in America had 0.5% of this country's wealth. Here we are in 2024, Black people have 1% of this country's wealth. We haven't really moved an iota in over 150, 160 years. So the needle has still been the same. And I'll ask this question now, and I'm sure this is a question you've probably been asked before or have given some thought to, because this came up, a lot of times. Do you feel that Black people should receive reparations for the things that have happened in the past for them?
I mean, I certainly think that's a morally sound position, right? I mean, I think reporting on the white bonus, like I think before I did this work, I was like, well, reparations, that seems reasonable, or, okay, not against it, but not sort of like, oh, it's really important. And now, I've just seen in close detail in 5 different families, right, how much government did for us, right? Government did a lot for white people, and it used to do more. But I think most middle class white people now, we wouldn't be in the comfortable position that we're in if government hadn't consistently made investments in us over time, right? And so I think it's only fair that we should be making those investments in everybody, right? And figuring out how to close that gap, right? Like the racial wealth gap between Black and white Americans has nothing to do with any cultural or intelligence difference or any of that, right? Like it's very much a product of government policy. Government made a decision to invest resources in white families and then didn't really do that for Black families. And that's why you see that gap.
Interesting. In your book, how did you go about finding the subjects for your book?
Yeah. So, I mean, one set of subjects is me and my family, right? So that was, I knew how to get that information pretty well. And then a couple of the people that I profile are folks that I had social ties to. So one of the profiles who is a guy about my age who in the 90s decided it would be a good idea when he was 17 to go to school and sell LSD out of his backpack. So he gets caught and gets a second chance, right? So he's going before a judge it was selling narcotics on school grounds, extortion, and larceny in a tough on crime district in 1994, right? So the height of punitive drug policing. And he gets given a second chance. And even he is very clear. He's like, that would not have happened if I wasn't white, right? Like, he's like, I would have gotten locked up and his life would have gone really differently. So that's someone I knew personally. There's a boomer era woman who was a part of the Jewish middle class in Houston who fell out of the middle class into working poverty. She's an interesting story because she actually got quite a bit of money through her family that you can trace back to racist policies. But she fell into working poverty, and she's in Texas, which did not expand Medicaid under the ACA. And so she's aging. She develops diabetes and doesn't know it. And so she dies, right? She goes into ketoacidosis at home and dies, right? Because there's not only benefits from racism, right? Racism also impoverishes our safety net and our democracy, right? So there are costs that everybody bears, including a lot of white people. And then the 2 other profiles, there are 2 millennial sisters who went through the Hattiesburg Public School District in Mississippi as it was resegregating in the early 2000s. And those are folks that was more of a traditional journalistic sort of technique, right? Which is that I knew professionals who did sort of media work and knew people. And so just sort of kept asking around for a few months to just find somebody who might be willing to talk with me. I didn't intend to do sisters. I thought I would just do one person, but the story worked out better that way. And then I also have a union nurse in Pittsburgh who comes from a construction trades family. And I found her through her union. So she's a member of SEIU and in sort of like a chapter leadership. And so that's how I found her, was through her union.
Did they have any worries about being a part of your book, and how did you gain their trust?
Yeah, I mean, certainly anybody who's being profiled in a book, I think, has anxieties about how they'll be portrayed, right? Because you're in a very vulnerable position. I think it helped a lot that I was doing the same thing with me and my family, right? So it's, journalism, right? You're usually going up to strangers and saying, hey, stranger, you're going through this thing that I'm not experiencing. I don't know anything about it. Can you tell me about it so I can tell other people about it? Right. But it's weird for me to go up to other white people and say, hey, could you tell me what it's like to be white? Because I don't know about that. Right. And because it's so sensitive in our culture, I think it was important that I was already doing some pretty like specific thinking about it, right? And could say, look, I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not doing myself. And I think it's also just true that, I do think that there's an increasing number of white people who sort of are coming to understand that racism is a real problem. I mean, that it, of course, is the worst for Black people, but that whole system maybe isn't creating the kind of country that we want to be in, right? And so it's, certainly I don't think that's a mainstream, like that's not like, a massive share of white people, but there's a number of them. So it just sort of was also a process of finding people that were open to working out these questions with me, right? Because I had to keep reminding myself, because, I think it took me almost 2 months to find the Union nurse and probably 3 or 4 to find the Mississippi folks. And I had to keep reminding myself, I don't need all the white people to talk to me. I just need one, right? I just need one person will do it. And, I do think patience paid off with that.
You're a trained journalist and investigative reporter. Can you talk about the experiences of writing such a personal book was for like, what was it like for you, and how did your professional training shape the memoir?
Yeah, so it was very different for me to be doing personal writing. Journalists are trained to keep themselves out of the story. And the first book I did, American Way of Eating, I went and I worked undercover in 3 jobs in the food system. So the deal there is I went and I worked as a farm worker, an Applebee's worker, and a Walmart worker. And then I had to live and eat off my wages in each job for 2 months. And then I used that to sort of have a broader conversation about food in class. But it gave me this sort of core storyline of like, here's me and what I'm doing. So I was kind of used to sort of using myself as like an objective character. But this book really required me to do a lot more of sort of peeling back layers around sort of emotions and feelings. Because I think, a lot of white people, and I certainly sometimes have been in this category, right? We get really defensive when we're talking about racial privilege and sort of don't know how to, kind of honestly don't understand what's going on, right? Because we're raised in this country to not see ourselves as having a race. So when you start getting out in the world, so you're raised, at least for me, right? I was raised to be colorblind, right? So I'm raised in a family where, as far as I understand, like people who aren't white have a race, but I'm just neutral. Like I don't have anything, right? And so when you get out in the world, and me, right? I moved to New York City at 17, right? And so I was a scholarship kid, and I had this weird life where I worked at a public high school in an AmeriCorps program. So every day, most days of the week, I spent like a couple of hours with like new immigrants and like Black and brown kids that were like working class kids in New York City. And then I would go to university with these upper middle class and rich kids from NYU. And then I had a nannying job at night with like a family that had like a 5,000 square foot loft in Soho, right? So like I would go the whole breadth of the American class system in one day, right? Just totally weird and different. And so, I get out there and, I realize when I'm working in this high school that like these kids see me as white, like I'm a white lady, which is totally weird. I had not grown up knowing how to do that. And right. And there are feelings that go along with that, right? So I had to sort of learn while working on this book to like figure out what emotions were going on so I could sort of unpack that and figure out how I was sort of feeling about race and racism. And then there's also just some deeper layers, like half of the book really is memoir, right? So it's not just about like, here's what happened to my family, but about like, here's what happened to me as a kid growing up. I actually detail in the book, my mom was really sick when I was growing up. So she had MS, and then she was hit by a drunk driver and got a head injury. So I was her caregiver for most of my elementary school years and things like that. And so there are all these things where I had experienced a fair amount of hardship. And I understood that a lot of my initial empathy, right, my sort of knee-jerk empathy around racism usually was tying back into those experiences of hardship. And so figuring out how to connect those dots, right? Because obviously, I get into this in the book, right? Like I'm growing up, my dad becomes abusive, right? My mom dies, like there's all this difficult stuff happening. And for me, like the times when I've had the strongest sort of feelings of empathy and concern around racism have been when I listen to somebody talking about what it's like to experience people telling you that abuse isn't, like that racism isn't happening, right? Or not being listened to, all that stuff. That's calling back to experiences I had had of abuse, right? But it's not the same thing, right? Obviously, like it's unfortunate that I grew up in a household that was having a hard time. It's unfortunate that my dad's temper got out of control, right? But I can get away from that, so I can sort of go, okay, well, I know what it's like to sort of have your sort of body disrespected and to be told it's not happening and have everybody be silent around you about it. And that sucks, but I can leave that. Like, what does that mean for people where it's not like your dad, it's the entire country that you're living in and 400 years of history pressing down like that, right? And thinking about that. So for me, like learning how to do that kind of writing for this book, right? That was like that was a heavy lift. I think I did all right with it. I would have liked to have 6 more months with the book to do a better job with it. But hopefully it's something that is effective for folks. I've been getting good feedback, so I'm optimistic it sort of pulls it off. But we'll see.
Yeah. Along those lines, you include a postscript at the end of the book explaining that your father cut ties with you and wrote you out of the will.
Mm-hmm.
How prepared were you for that, and why did you choose to include it in the book?
I'd sort of talked myself out of it being a serious concern. I've gone through, my relationship with my dad is not easy. So we have had really fraught conversations and interactions before. And I mean, I write about this in the book. There were 5 years sort of during and after college when I didn't have anything to do with them. Like they weren't supporting me. I wasn't talking to them. And that's fine. And I had thinking that maybe we'd all grown past that. And I felt willing to sort of work through the feelings I had about the things I didn't like about my upbringing with my dad, if he would talk to me. And that's just not where he's at. That's not what he wants to talk about. So I ended up, I included it because, up until, and I should say like this sort of disinheriting thing only happened very, very late in the book process. I was raised thinking that there was no money to hand down, right? That we didn't have money. When my mom was sick, we couldn't afford her care. At least that's what my father told me, that we couldn't afford her care. And I largely put myself through university. So I didn't grow up thinking there would be an inheritance. And then in 2022, my father and stepmother announced that they were forming a trust and we were all going to inherit some money, which, as an independent writer is welcome news, but a little weird, right? A little strange to be like, so you had money like all this time. And like, I've been on like food stamps and like unable to afford groceries, like, but you all have been fine like that. Okay. That I'm going to work through my feelings about that. But when it got to the point in the book that like they decided that they didn't want to talk to me anymore, and that because I was writing about the things that happened when I grew up, I just felt like I needed to be honest about that, because until, right, the way that the book ends, where the sort of normal ending of the book, right, is that I hear I'm going to be getting a trust, right? Because that is, I think for anybody in the white middle class, right, like these inheritances that we get, they often would not have been possible if it wasn't for the investments government made in our families a generation or two ago, right? And some of that looks like the GI Bill. A lot of that, like for my parents, right, who are boomers, like that looks like government used to spend a lot more money, state government used to spend a lot more money subsidizing higher education, right? And as the college going population has become more diverse, white voters have become less willing to support taxes, right, that can then go into higher education, right? And so that stuff gets more and more expensive. And that's part of the root of this student debt crisis, right, is that states stop spending money on it, right? So government made these investments that allowed my family to have money to leave to me, right? So I had to write about that. But I thought it was also important to talk about, that when you speak up about things in this country, right? Sometimes like you'll pay a price for that, right? And I think that's a big reason why more white people don't ever want to talk about this bonus stuff, right? Because then you've got to start looking at your parents, then you've got to start looking at the generations that came before you and think through like where you're willing to have tension and where you're not.
Interesting. You write that this book puts white people at its center, quote, myopically focus on our experience. And you critique Main Street journalists, and yourself included, for practicing this myopia far too long. And yet the book's primary subjects are all white. Why?
Because this is like the one story about white people America does not ever want to tell, right? I mean, this is something that we really need to talk about and be clear about. I mean, and when I say we, I really mean white people, right? Like white people need to understand that this is part of our country's inheritance and our inheritance, right? Which is that we used to invest in people. We did that when white voters would support that when they thought it was white people getting that investment. And, you know, it's really hard to see that if you don't ever talk about whiteness, right? Like the way that we often are sort of digging in, you know, the myopia, let me rephrase that. The myopia I'm talking about is this assumption that whiteness is neutral and normal, and that everybody who is reading your article will be white and wealthy, often is the assumption, right? And so the decisions you make about which stories you pick, how you describe your subjects, the kinds of questions that you ask, the headlines that you write for stories, those are all made. I mean, the Kerner Commission wrote about this in the 60s. Those are all made with the assumption that it's a rich white person reading. And I think that really contorts reporting and research and our democracy, and like that we shouldn't be doing. At the same time, if we don't learn how to be honest about the fact that whiteness is given advantages in our society and our economy, right, we're never going to be able to live up to the ideals, right, of our democracy. Like that's never going to happen unless we start being honest about this.
Why don't you focus the profiles on members of the American middle class and only in the 20th and 21st centuries?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really strong and amazing reporting on the sort of enslavement era, right, and just after. And so I didn't feel like I had the skill set to really report on that, right? Like I'm not a historian, so that was going to be a pretty heavy lift. And also because I think because there's so much strong reporting on like that era, I think a lot of white people have a tendency to be sort of like, oh, well, but like all that racial advantage, that was just like during like enslavement times. And like, it's been a lot better since. And actually, and as my reporting in the White Bonus shows, right, an awful lot of advantage gets handed to white people in the 20th century by government, right? Like you don't have to go back to like the days of bondage to find government sort of putting investments into white people, right? You can find that easily in the 20th century. As for the middle class part, right, I picked white middle class folks a little bit by accident. Like initially my idea was I'm going to do this broad scan from poor to rich and sort of go up and down the class ladder. And I was having a really hard time finding either wealthy or poor white people who were willing to have this conversation with me. So there's a little bit of, you know, I do think if I'd been like, you know what, that is so important, I'm just going to stick it out until I find that one person, that would have been possible. But I sort of ran out of time. And it's also true that the white middle class, I think, is the fulcrum for preserving racism in the US, right? Because we're the ones who can see clearly how fast we could drop. So we get a lot more sort of defensive and clingy about the privileges that we do have. But we also see, right, that rich people have really different options, that the economy isn't actually all that fair, right? So it's like a really interesting position. And for me, you know, when I was reporting on like the Deep South and particularly like education policy, you know, I really came back to like Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, right, where he talks about the white moderate, because what he's talking about is the white middle class, right? And the white folks in that era who were absolutely willing to go along with like really vicious white supremacists because they thought it was going to benefit their kids, right, in terms of schools. And I just think we often sort of skew our view like at one end of the spectrum or the other, and that sort of lets white middle class people off the hook a lot.
Americans rarely talk about class and race at the same time, but both are at the heart of your work. What do you think are the blind spots among journalists and writers, at least when it comes to race and class? And why did you want to take on this work now?
Yeah, well, I think there's a real tendency to pathologize people who aren't white, and especially Black people, and just to assume that Black people, if you are Black, you will be poor, right? And that sort of ends up translating into media coverage, right? That is constantly reflecting Black hardship. And obviously, we need to be honest about hardship. Hardship, because of structural racism, is disproportionately Black and brown in this country. But it also means that you sort of ignore the sort of middle class and upper class folks, right, who are of color in this country and who have had to work a lot harder to get into those positions usually, right, than me and my family have. And at the same time, because you're constantly, and this is, something that goes back to like the 60s, because you're always reflecting Blackness as poverty, right, that also means you're obscuring the very common occurrence of white poverty, right, which is disproportionately like it's not as common among white folks as among Black folks, but it's still like a big problem, right? And in fact, at the last time I looked at the statistics, right, the majority of poverty in the U.S., the majority of poor people in this country are white, right? Because there's so many more white people, right? And so when you obscure that, then for white people who are poor, it looks like nobody cares about what's going on for you, right? Because you see all this coverage of like Black poverty. And you think, well, like, but what about me? Like, I also like am on food stamps and trying to figure this stuff out and all this, right? So it really makes it hard to have an honest conversation, both about our economy and how to address poverty in this country, because we're constantly racializing it and not being honest about sort of what's hurting people.
And you write about how the abuse you experienced made you more likely to excuse abuse of others, and speak about how this is the root of white grievance. Can you explain?
Yeah. So, I write in the book about a period in my family when my father was really losing his temper a lot and becoming pretty viciously violent. And so there's a pretty difficult scene that I described, right, where my father and I had a serious physical fight. And, that happened. And my stepmother had us sit down. My dad and I sit down at a table. My dad was sort of like, she just has to learn, like, I didn't do anything she didn't deserve, and so on and so forth. And then from that time forward, my entire family acted like it had not happened, right? And like I called my grandmother, my mother's mother, and asked to go stay with her because I was scared. Like during the fight, I actually feared for my life. My father was being extremely violent with me. And she said, well, I think you just need to stay there and stay out of his way. Right. And so this thing evolved in my family, and the abuse that I experienced was really difficult for me. And it was really, it was traumatizing, but I think the level of abuse I was experiencing was very common, right? Like this was not something where it was like every single day I was getting hit. This was, my father has a difficulty with his temper and he would lose it. And if you caught him at the wrong time, right, you could really end up getting hurt. But everybody around us stayed silent about it, right? So the adults around us and my family stayed silent about it. I later found out that teachers at the high school I attended could tell that there was probably physical violence happening in our household. They never said anything, right? Because they were deferring to my white middle class father and leaving him alone. And so what that teaches you as a kid growing up in a household like that, right, is that nobody is going to stand up for you and that you just have to suck it up, right? No matter how bad things get, if it will not kill you, you just need to deal with it. And I think that makes it really hard if you sort of grow up with that. And I don't have statistics on this, but I feel like this also is part of the white grievance, because white middle class kids that grow up in abusive households learn that you just have to put up with it, right? Because there's so much less likely to be intervention on the part of other adults, particularly institutions, right? like on the behalf of children, right? Because I mean, the statistics around intervention in Black families, right? If there's any suspicion of abuse or neglect, right, that Black families get policed much more heavily. And so for white kids, right, you just sort of like, well, you have to put up with it. And then you get out in the world, and then you start hearing like folks from the Black community talking about being like, I'm not going to put up with being treated poorly in this place or this or that. And as a white person, you feel like your whole life you've just had to sit there and suck it up, right? Including getting hit, right? So when you see that sympathy out in the world, right, it creates this sort of disconnect. And so I think part of what happens is if you're raised, not obviously like abuse is, I think it's very common, but it's not every family. But if you get raised in a household where, you know, the MO is you just have to endure bad things and deal with it, it's really confusing to then be out in the world and see people of color asking to be treated well. And you're like, well, why do they get to be treated well when my whole life I've had to just put up with being treated badly, right? Like that disconnect is, I think, can be really hard for folks.
How did you come up with the idea of a white bonus, and what does a white bonus comprise?
So I came up with the idea of a white bonus because I wanted to figure out how to measure sort of the cash value of whiteness. So I was trying to think, I was like, well, like I've heard of this idea of a Black tax, right? That like Black folks are given less opportunity and also get charged more, right? Like groceries in poor Black neighborhoods are often a higher price for poorer quality, right, than they are in sort of similarly in a similar income level, like white neighborhood. But what would it be if it was, what do you call the inverse of the Black tax, right? And I was like, well, white bonus, like that's kind of what it is, because it's stuff that, you know, white folks get given. And it's not, you know, I think about this a lot about, do you deserve it or not? And I'm like, it's not that white folks don't deserve it, but like we're getting stuff that everybody deserves, but it's only being given to us, right? Like is kind of how I think about it. And then, you know, so the white bonus is a rough back of the envelope calculation of the amount of money an individual white person gets or saves because of white supremacy in public policy and private practice, right? So that could be like the GI Bill in practice only being extended to white GIs, which is largely what happened after World War II. That could be federal mortgage assistance being contingent on a house being in a segregated neighborhood, ideally in a white neighborhood, right? Which is also was very common in mid-century. If we're talking about private practice, right? Again, if we're going into housing, racial covenants, right? Provisions on the deeds of property that made it illegal for a Black person or often just anyone who is not Caucasian to occupy a home, right? And under punishment, right, that, you know, the police could be called by your neighbors if you were a Black person. And this happened a few times in the historic record, right, where there was a racially segregated neighborhood. And so a Black person would get a white friend to like buy the house and then sell it to them immediately, right? And then people would call the police and have the Black people thrown out of the house they had bought, right? Which was provided for in the deed, right? And that became illegal in 1948. But housing discrimination stayed legal for another 20 years, right? Until the Housing Rights Act. And so, right, the white bonus is the way that I measure it. And this is, again, very back of the envelope calculation. There's two components. The primary one is your family bonus. So that's like, how much money, this is for white people only, right? It's not a white bonus if you're not white, but for white people, right? How much money has your family given you since you turned 18 or left home? And then you go back through the historic record and you say, well, how likely is it your family would have had that money if they weren't white, right? And so for me, right, that number is like $146,000 over 30 years, right? And that's, you know, a little bit of money for college here. That's a little bit of an inheritance when my grandfather died there, right? And it turns out, right, all the money for me comes back to one grandfather who was employed as a banker, right? So he became a banker in the 1930s when there were about 250,000 bankers in the US, only 80 of which, out of 250,000, only 80 of which were Black, right? So grandpa was not going to have that job if he wasn't white, right? And then he had a house with a racial covenant. I should say I have a more blue collar side of my family that left less money, but had access to like the same racial covenants and things like that, right? So they stayed, not poor because of that stuff. So you have the family bonus, and then there's a social bonus. So that's the money that I get as an adult when I'm out in the world and doors get opened for me and either save me money or get me money, right? So one of the things I sort of pull together is, I got a job, I was nannying job for a family that seems clearly to have been tied to my being white. The mom told me, like, look, this is an easy job, which is true. It's a very easy job. I know that this is an easy job. It pays well. And, part of the reason I need you here is my kids are never going to have to work, and they need to know somehow that people do. Right. So there were people of color who come and work in their house. Right. Like they needed somebody who looked like them. Right. They needed somebody who could have readily been their classmate at the private schools they were attending. Right. Like the mom was white, put herself through school as well, felt a kinship with me. Right. So I don't think I would have gotten hired for that job if I had not been white. Right. So then that job was paying me $200 a week for about 12 hours of work in 1995, 96, 97. So then what I do, right, is I go and I calculate, well, how much more than minimum wage was I making by having that job? And then that's part of my white bonus, right? Because I was able to earn that extra money. But then that same family, right, co-signs for my first apartment in New York. So I'm only able to really get housing because I had that relationship with that family. I had that relationship with that family because I'm white, right? So then how much did that apartment, which was rent stabilized, so it saves me money, how much money did I save because of that? Right. And things like that. And then something else I sort of gamed out was, one of the most stabilizing things for me as an independent journalist, because I know like I have this impressive resume, right? But like most years, my income, like my salary type, my adjusted gross income, like the equivalent thing to if I had a salary, is like 25 to 35,000, right? Like I don't make great money, right? But also my expenses are low, right? But the one reason I have a stable life is that I own property in Detroit. So how was I able to own property in Detroit when I make so little money, right? So some of it's that I had a fellowship for a year and I saved a bunch of money and was able to buy, but the house I bought was $27,000 right? In a major city in Detroit. So how come that was so cheap? Well, if you look back through the historic record, right, Detroit's housing market imploded because of the subprime crisis, right? And the subprime crisis hit Detroit particularly hard because subprime lending was targeted at Black households, right? Detroit was the heart of Black home ownership in this country, right? More than half of the Black families in Detroit owned their homes before the subprime crisis, right? So what happens is cities already lost a lot of money and having a hard time because of white flight and divestment, which incidentally, I mean, a lot of like your listeners probably understand this. I think most white people do not. A lot of the white flight of the 60s, that was about schools first, right? In my household, we talked about it as being related to like violence in the city, but statistically, right, white people fled the cities because they didn't want to share schools with Black people, right? So you lose all this tax base in Detroit. It goes through all these hard times. The housing market crashes. Then there's a tax foreclosure crisis on top of that, right? All this puts the housing on super sale. So I'm able to come in and buy at a price that I can afford. And that means right now I have equity, right? Because that market has come back, right? And so this is also the weird thing about sort of like racism, right? Like we talk about it as being like only about taking from Black people. And now I'm trying to get people to talk about what it gives to white people. But it also can give and take on either side, right? Like there are ways that people of color, like any person of color who came in and bought low and now can sell high, right? They have profited a little bit because of the way racism ruined that housing market and that local economy, right? But it's also true, and I sort of game this out. I don't game this out with numbers, but I talk about this in the book, right? Racism completely like eviscerates our safety net. It ruins our democracy. And so like when white people need a safety net, right, they end up having to make up for it with their own money if they can, or they just get hurt, right? So like I write about this woman who dies because we don't have Medicaid, right, in Texas, right? So like white people do also pay a cost for racism. It's not as direct, like it's more of a collateral damage, right? But I think the thing that's powerful about talking about a white bonus is that once you measure what white people get, then you can legitimately also talk about what it's taking from everybody, including white people. And that calls into question, is this even worth it? Right? Because I think for a long time, white people have stayed silent and we have allowed racism to persist and continue and fester and grow because we thought it was benefiting us and it wasn't going to ever like be a negative for us. And I think now what we're seeing is the things that racism ruins outside of just individual like people of color, like outside of communities of color, it ruins so much of the collective fabric that for a lot of white people, anyone who's not so rich that you couldn't ever possibly need public health care, if you're not that rich, you're going to need the safety net. You or someone you love is going to need the safety net, right? So there's a real question of like, is it worth it to stay silent, right? Because it's hurting everybody.
What's the difference between white privilege and white bonus, and why does it matter?
White privilege is really amorphous, right? So, I think my problem with white privilege is that it's something that constantly shifts. So if, I'm talking to a Black colleague in journalism who's talking to me about my white privilege, like my instinct is often to be like, yes, but I don't have as much money. Like your parents paid for college, but my didn't pay for college, right? So you start arguing about like which kind of privilege. And there's often, the sort of undercurrent is like, well, does privilege even exist? Like, which thing are we talking about? You can't grab onto it, right? But once you're talking about numbers, right, it makes it real. And then you're not talking about like, does it exist? You're talking about how big is it? And I think that's an important shift that we need to make.
I know there's been a lot of discussion. I've heard, a lot of pundits talk about America. And in your opinion, do you think America is a racist country, or is there just a lot of racism in America?
Or is it what?
Or is there just a lot of racism in America?
I mean, I think if you go back through the historic record, right, like we were founded by people who subscribed to white supremacy, right? So a lot of the systems that we have in place, right, were designed to uphold racism. So I think when you say, is America a racist country, that's sort of like, well, what does it feel inside? And I'm like, I don't know like what America feels inside, but I know that like most of our institutions, right, have been built and certainly have been used, right, to privilege white folks over others, right? So I don't know that it matters like what the identity is so much as what do its institutions do and what do they create? And right now it makes a very racially unequal country. And if we are serious now as the Americans living today that everybody is equal, then we need to be doing more work, right, to end racism, because like those two things can't coexist at the same time.
Speaking of wealth, there has been some stories that have been written here within the last couple of years. Primarily, I think it was a Black couple out in, I think it was California. They went to sell their house and they got their house appraised, and it appraised really low. And then they had one of their right friends go in and pose like they were the owners, and they had to, I call de-black their house. And when they did that, the house appraised, I think it was like $800,000 more. What do you think about that? What's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that there's a lot of racism in housing, right? Housing discrimination is alive and well. I mean, something I hadn't really thought through. I mean, I should say there's also, there's an interesting case of that in Baltimore also, right? With like a very like accomplished Black couple. I mean,
professor, I believe.
Brilliant professors, right? I mean, I've talked with Nathan Connolly, like as a reporter, brilliant professors and wonderful community members, all that good stuff, right? And they, and those, they go to sell their house, same thing happens, right? And you keep seeing that again and again. And I think, for me, when I came into doing the white bonus, I understood like, oh, well, like there used to be racial covenants, and that was a problem with housing. And, well, there was discrimination in mortgage lending back in the 60s, and some stuff is still happening, right? But, it's just as a small, like, anecdote, I was talking to one of my subjects who bought a house in 2016 in the Bay Area. And when he and his wife were, they were making offers, there's a white couple in their 30s, the realtor was like, well, you need to do a love letter, right? And maybe put in a picture, right, of you guys together, because you want to ingratiate yourself to the owner, right? So you're trying to, like, establish common ground with the owner and make them like you and all this stuff, right? So they do, like, this cute little picture, like kissing. And right, like in 2020, right, with that racial reckoning, right, the National Association of, like, Realtors, right, like, issues a statement being like, don't do love letters because it's opening the door to racial discrimination, right? And I think probably, right, most Black home buyers already knew that. And I would bet you most white home buyers had never thought about it that way, right, until they saw that. I had never thought about that until I was doing this work. And, that edict came out in 2020 from the Professional Association. Both my partner and I were looking at housing in Detroit, and we're encouraged to write love letters, right, in 2021, right? So the realtors are not necessarily following that edict, right? And so I think that practice persists, right, suggests that it's really powerful, right? That the discrimination in housing just keeps going. And, we'll see what happens over time with, what sort of intervention will come, like, to try and limit that.
Yeah. I heard you talk about the Black tax. You mentioned that. And I've talked to several Black families, people that I know that have had houses, that were in, I call nice neighborhoods, and they went to sell them. They had to de-black their house. I remember in Earl Graves, the late Earl Graves, who was the editor of Black Enterprise magazine, in his book, How to Succeed in Business Without Being White. And there's a chapter in his book where he talks about he and his wife, when they went to sell their house. I think they stayed in an upscale neighborhood in either New York or New Jersey. And they had the house on the market for a long period of time and couldn't sell it, couldn't even get an offer. So they had talked to some friends, and they told them, hey, you need to de-black your house. They took down all the pictures, put away anything you had any hint of ethnicity, any type of food, anything. And they sold their house, I think, after that, within 2 weeks. I had the same thing happen to myself, my wife and I, when we had bought our first house years ago. And we had a nice little house. It was a little bungalow. We finished the basement. It was just a really nice little place, cute. And we put it on the market. I mean, didn't get anything. So I spoke to a friend of mine that lives here in town also, who had a really nice house in an affluent area. And he said, hey, we couldn't get our house sold, and we just went in, we took down all our pictures. We did this, and this. And he said, man, we did that. We sold our house in like 4 days. So I talked to my wife and said, listen, put up all the pictures that we have, family pictures, put away the Ebony magazine, the Jet magazines, go out and get Popular Mechanics, go out and get Women's Day. We went and bought picture frames that already have pictures of white people in them, and we put them up in our house, and we sold our house in 6 days. So when I hear people talk about that, de-blacking their house, I know exactly what they're talking about. And again, I've talked to several people
I'm really sorry that you have to do that. I understand why you have to, but I'm really sorry. This also, though, I'm like, this is so interesting to hear, like, what you have to put in a house to make it white. Like, mechanics and Women's Day. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. We got all the hot sauce.
You have to get rid of the hot sauce.
Hot sauce bottles, anything you had any hint of ethnicity, we eliminated it, didn't have anything. We just made the house as plain and bland as we can. And like I said, and then sold it. And the interesting thing, when we went to the closing, the couple that bought our house didn't realize we were Black until we actually walked in the closing. Right. And the look on their face when we walked in was, that of astonishment. And I said, "Oh, too late now. We got your earnest money."
Well, it's interesting. You know, I did a bunch of digging about my family's property history, and the first house that my parents bought in a first ring suburb of Detroit was bought by a Black couple. And my dad was like, I didn't know who they were. Like, they didn't come to the closing. And I was like, oh, I wonder if, you know, did they make that choice on purpose, right? Were they like, we'll just send the lawyer because we don't want to deal with like white folks not wanting to sell this house to us.
Yeah. I had another situation that happened. You know, I used to invest in a lot of real estate back in the day, and I had bought a house. It was elderly gentleman that lived there. I never had a chance to meet him until we actually went to the closing. And I remember going to the closing, and when I walked in, we actually had the closing at the courthouse in one of the adjacent rooms to the courthouse, because it was, I can't remember all the exact particulars behind it, but I know when I walked into the room, this old man, his eyes got this big, and they were just glazing at me, just looking at me. Followed me all the way till I sat down, and I sat down in the chair, and his sister was there with him as well. And he turned to his sister and he said, I didn't know I was selling my house to a Black. And nobody wanted to act like they heard it. None of the real estate agents. And his sister, you know, without missing a beat, she just tapped him on the hand. He said, don't worry about it. He's going to rent it to some really nice white people. And it was, you know, I just kept a straight face because I wanted to get the house. It was nice. I was getting it for a good price. But it was funny because none of the real estate agents try to act like they didn't hear it. You know,
right,
everybody say, okay, well, we didn't hear that one. We're just going to move on, you know. But right. I mean, those are just some of the things, you know, that I know I've experienced personally. And I've got all sorts of stories from other people that have experienced the same thing as well. You know, it was interesting too. You know, about 20 years ago, I was a real estate developer here in Springfield, and we built a subdivision of houses in a predominantly Black area of town, but it was kind of isolated, so it wasn't in the hood, if you will. It was kind of a tract of land, and we built these houses, very nice homes that we built. And I remember, you know, when we were marketing the homes to sell, you know, we didn't get not one white person that wanted to move over there. Not a one. I mean, someone would call and they would find out, hey, where is that located at? I have never heard of this Eastview Estates. And we tell them where it was at. They hang up the phone, you know. It's interesting now. I heard 20 years later, it's probably one of the nicest subdivisions in the city of Springfield. Wow. It's well maintained. And now guess who's buying the homes over there when they do come available? It's whites that are buying the homes because, one, the prices are reasonable, it's well maintained, and I guess the fear factor is gone out of, you know, them wanting to live in, you know, all Black neighborhoods. So, right. You know, some of the things you talk about, I've experienced them and had some personal experiences with them as well. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, the beat goes on, you know, and you just have to, it's just something you, like you said, you suck it up. You know, it's just a part of being Black in America, you know, and some people don't realize what some of the things that you talk about or go through, or they talk about, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, it's fine if you got boots on.
Right. Yeah.
If you don't have any straps to pull up with, what do you do? So, but I try not to make any excuses, even though which I could, but, you know, the bottom line is that you still have to push forward, because if not, you'll stay stagnated.
Right.
You know, you write about how you didn't know much of the history around racism in the place you were raised. What stories stood out to you, and why do you think you never heard these stories, and why does it matter to you?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there's a number that I didn't know. You know, I was born in Pontiac, which is an industrial town north of Detroit. And in 1971, the Klan blew up 10 school buses to prolong segregation there. Nobody was on the buses, right? They just blew them up when they were at the depot, because the next day the schools were supposed to integrate, which I'd never heard of, and seems kind of wild that I wouldn't know that had happened in the town. I mean, I was born there. My mother was born there. My grandparents were born there. And also, my parents moved out to an exurb, like a sort of rural community, when I was 4.5 years old. And I was always told we had to move because of the schools. So I thought that we had moved for good schools. And upon sort of researching this, what I learned was that the school district we had been zoned into before we moved was integrating. And so it was the Ferndale schools outside of Detroit was the first northern school district sued by the federal government for running a segregated district. So they got sued in 1969. The paperwork started in 68, but the case was filed in 69. And that district fought tooth and nail for 13 years to stay segregated. And I put documents up on my website. It's like the same stuff in every southern school districts, right? In terms of saying, well, we're just going to pretend we don't have to. And then we're going to say that it's freedom of choice, which means we'll be like, okay, you could go to other schools, and then nobody changes, right? And they also, they don't change the funding. Like the Black school in that district had been operating at a overcrowded capacity since the 40s. And by the time these cases were going through, was running classes on half-day schedules because they had so many kids, and the district refused to move Black students into empty desks in white schools, right, at this elementary. I mean, it was really appalling. They fought it for 13 years. They integrated in January 1981. My parents moved in June, and I started kindergarten in an underfunded rural district that was in danger of losing accreditation in September of that year, right? And so that's also something I didn't know anything about, even though it's like a very big part of my region's history.
Really?
Yeah.
You're developing a white bonus estimator as you prepare to launch your book. What do you hope that tool can accomplish, and what do you think people will learn from it?
Right. So it's that is still under development. That is more complicated a project than I had hoped. Certainly beyond my capacity, in part because I have a part-time job. So but I think a white bonus estimator, which again, an estimator is key, right? None of these numbers, I think any number you come up with is going to be an undercount, right? There's, you would need like interdisciplinary teams of scholars working for years to come up with something that was at the level of social science, right? But you can sort of walk people through the kinds of calculations I made for this book, right? Like you can sort of come up with reasonable estimates for how much a family has spent. Like if you just sort of run through a questionnaire and then sort of be like, well, did you have a grandpa who went to war in World War II who is white? And did he get a college education with the GI Bill? Right. So that probably trickles down, right? And figuring that stuff out. Because I think for me, what's important is just framing this out for white folks. Because I understand there's very little in my book in terms of the overall idea that will be a surprise to Black people, right? But most white people, when I say racism gives us a benefit, they're like, I've never really thought about it that way, that it gives me money, right? Very clear to everybody else, not to us, right? So I think that hopefully it sort of helps make that shift. And also to the extent that this is of use to people, right? It takes some of the burden of trying to make that point to white people off of people of color, right? Like it should not be the job of the folks getting screwed by the system to explain to the people benefiting that they're benefiting, right? Like that's messed up, right? So, and I also understand nobody asked me to do that, and that's fine. But I just feel like, this is such a tricky discussion. And if there's some resource out there that sort of is like, this is the conversation we're going to have, and these are the terms we're going to have it on, at least then it's not on like every Black person out there to be like, I have a white friend that I would like to be better about this. And now I got to figure out how to bring it up. And whether or not, right, you can just sort of be like, did you see this white bonus thing? Like, maybe you should go look at it. Like, right, it takes some of that pressure off. To the extent that that's helpful, that's cool. But I just think I hope for better conversations and more of an understanding that, I think we can make this country better. I think we can make it more like what we're all raised to think it should be. But like, we got to dig in and do it. And I think one of the most effective ways that we can make positive change is by seeing ending racism like an integral part of anything that we're doing.
A lot of people thought that when Barack Obama got elected president, that there was the end of racism related to America, which we know that that's not true. But what are your thoughts in terms of when that actually happened? What did you feel about America when he was elected president from a white perspective?
Right. So I can do this, but I'm going to have to go in a second because I have to see some colleagues.
Sure.
I don't think I can tell you when racism will end. I don't have a good read on that timeline. And I will say, I think that, any oppressive system shapeshifts, right? And it evolves, right? There's no, we're just done, right? What will happen is we'll solve some elements of it and then it will change. And then we have a new set of problems that we have to continue working on, right? I'm a student of Robin D.G. Kelly, who's a historian of African-American history, and sort of hit a point I hear him make a lot that I thought about a lot when I was working on this book is that, the only thing that is consistent is struggle, not in a hard, awful way, but just that the world is never done, right? So you kind of always have to be figuring out how to engage with it and what you want to make better. And so I think for me, the thing that's important is just as much as possible being clear that, working towards ending racism, will get us closer to a reality where it's not happening, right? But also there's never going to be we have checked all the boxes and we're done. It's certainly not in my lifetime, right? This has been something that's been evolving for hundreds of years, because, at the core of it, right, racism is the logic that white people use to tell ourselves that some people deserve more than others, right? Because it's not actually, we talk about it in terms of skin color in the US, but the reason for it is not skin color. Skin color is the excuse we use. The reason for it is to justify hoarding resources. Right. And so somebody's always going to be trying to get more than somebody else, I think. I mean, maybe we can evolve past that. But for me, the goal is to just be you know what, we're going to work as hard as we can. And white people, I think, should be a lot more active in trying to end racism because it's going to be, I think that actually would be better for us than almost as white people, right? I think that would benefit white people a lot, as well as being the right thing to do for people of color. Because I think the interesting thing about that, right, is it switches ending racism from charity to something that's about joint liberation and equality. And I think that's important.
Yeah. One last question for you, and I appreciate you taking the time to do the show. But there are a lot of references in the book to deserving. Patients prove they must deserve coverage from healthcare companies. Some of your subjects talk about feeling they deserve something, a promotion, a scholarship, or didn't deserve to be denied something. You also share that showing that Black Americans often have to prove they deserve access to things white people take for granted. Can you talk about the role deserving plays in our culture and politics?
I come to this work as somebody who's done a lot of reporting on poverty and sort of low income communities in America. So I pay a lot of attention to the safety net. And in the 25 years that I have paid attention to it, right, we've gotten more and more punitive with whatever aid we give out from government. It's particularly true with work requirements, right, which are things that were introduced to cash assistance under President Clinton and have been a part of food stamps for a long time as well. And increasingly, Republican legislators are trying to introduce to Medicaid. And whenever you start building a system to prove who deserves what, right, it just means you're going to hurt a lot of people, right? And spend a lot of time and energy trying to prove who deserves something instead of just being like, you know what? We all deserve to have enough. And I think we would do a lot better as a country and as a society if we were approaching, the wealth that we have with looking at like, how do we make sure that we all have enough instead of trying to prove that like somebody who's struggling like really deserves it. And I think so much of that's overlaid with race in our country. And right, that's the logic that we use to justify making things punitive and tiny. And then we just all we focus on proving who deserves what instead of just taking care of people. And there's no reason for that.
Yeah. Tracie, thank you for being on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation. Folks, we've been visiting with Tracie McMillan, author of the book, The White Bonus. How can our listeners get a copy of your book, Tracie?
Yeah, well, anywhere that sells books will be able to get it. Amazon, right, is I think a somewhat evil company. However, it's probably going to be the most convenient. Or Bookshop, right, which is where independent bookstores go. And you can also order it at your local independent bookseller. Some places are stocking it, but we have been having difficulty getting, honestly, like national media attention with the book. Other than that, I mean, the CNN piece was great, but we're just having difficulty getting attention for the work. So folks might have to ask for it, but those are the places to get it.
Yeah, well, we'll hopefully try to help you spread your story. And again, thank you once again for being on the show. And I'll be following you and seeing how things are going. And might reach back out to you at some point in time to do a follow-up interview to see how the book is going and what other hurdles that you've had to overcome. Tracie, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And again, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Have a good night.
You too.
Okay.